The drone descends slowly through 30 feet of water, so clear it barely looks like water at all, more like falling through glass. And then, at the bottom of that first vertical shaft, the light from the surface simply stops. Not fades, stops. The operator watches the feed go from brilliant turquoise to a blue so dark it reads as black on the monitor, and the drone's own lights switch on automatically, throwing a narrow cone of illumination into a passage that no natural light has touched in any meaningful way for longer than human civilization has existed in Texas. This is Jacob's Well, a 12-foot opening in a creek bed in the Texas Hill Country, an hour outside Austin, that looks, from the surface, like nothing more than an unusually pretty swimming hole. It is not a swimming hole. It is the open mouth of one of the longest and most dangerous fully submerged cave systems in the state of Texas, a labyrinth of flooded limestone passages that drops more than 100 feet straight down before twisting away into total darkness for thousands of feet in every direction. And for over a century, the only way anyone has ever been able to see what is actually down there has required a human being to physically swim into it. At least 9 of those human beings never swam back out. This is the story of what happens when you finally send something other than a person into Jacob's Well. What the cameras actually showed, why the people who have spent their careers studying this place describe the footage not with excitement, but with a specific, quiet unease that is hard to manufacture and harder to fake. And why, even with the drone's lights cutting through water that has swallowed more divers than almost any cave system in North America, the most unsettling part of what it found wasn't a creature or a body or anything supernatural at all. It was the simple, undeniable scale of what has been sitting beneath that small green pool the entire time. To understand why Jacob's Well commands this kind of reaction from people who are not easily rattled, you have to understand what it actually is, geologically, and why it exists at all. Jacob's Well is what hydrogeologists call an artesian spring, a point where groundwater under pressure forces its way to the surface through a natural opening in the rock, without need of a pump or any mechanical assistance. The water feeding it comes from the Trinity Aquifer, a vast underground reservoir of water held inside porous limestone that stretches across a large portion of central Texas, replenished slowly over time by rainfall filtering down through the soil and rock above it. Limestone is soluble over geological time spans, not centuries, but tens of thousands and likely hundreds of thousands of years. Slightly acidic groundwater dissolves channels through it, the same basic process that carves every limestone cave system on Earth. At Jacob's Well, that process didn't just carve a single cave, it carved an entire branching network, a principal passage that researchers have come to call the A Tunnel, running generally northwest from the spring's opening and extending, by current survey measurements, roughly 4,500 feet from the surface entrance. The tunnel itself isn't a uniform shaft. It descends in stages, an initial vertical drop of about 30 feet, followed by an angled descent through a series of constricted passages, opening periodically into wider chambers before narrowing again, reaching a maximum documented depth of 137 feet before the mapped sections give way to areas that remain, even now, beyond what any diver has been able to safely chart. That last detail matters more than it might initially seem to, because the organization responsible for almost everything we currently know about the internal structure of Jacob's Well, a volunteer coalition of trained cave divers called the Jacob's Well Exploration Project, formally established in 2007, has spent nearly 2 decades mapping the system using traditional scuba techniques, and their own published survey results describe the environment in language that is notably restrained for a group of professionals who chose this work voluntarily. They call it, in their own official documentation, a challenging, unforgiving environment. People who routinely descend into flooded limestone caves for a living do not reach for language like that casually. The reason becomes clear almost immediately once you understand the specific architecture of the danger. Jacob's Well is not simply deep. It is structurally deceptive in ways that have proven lethal even to experienced, properly trained divers. At several points within the system, the passage narrows to gaps as tight as 15 inches across, spaces requiring a diver to remove their air tank entirely and push it through ahead of or behind their body, in zero visibility, at depth, with no straight path back to the surface. The floor in several of the deeper chambers is not solid rock, but loose gravel and fine silt, sediment that has been accumulating, undisturbed, for an unknowable span of time. The moment that sediment is touched, by a fin kick, by an exhaled bubble, by the simple physical presence of a body moving through a confined space, it billows upward and transforms what was already near zero visibility into absolute, total blindness. Divers who have made it deep into the system and returned have described it in exactly those terms. Unable to see their own gauges, navigating entirely by feel and memory, scraping the cave ceiling with their tanks, while their hands searched blindly for the guideline that was their only route back to open water. And then there is the feature that has been responsible, by multiple independent accounts, for at least one confirmed death, and likely more, a structural quirk in the cave's third chamber that local divers and researchers refer to as the false chimney. From certain angles and low visibility, this formation appears to be an open passage leading upward, toward the surface, toward air, toward safety. It is not. It is a dead end, a geological trap shaped almost perfectly to mimic the one thing a panicking, disoriented diver running low on air is most desperate to find. Divers have entered it believing they had found their way out. Some of them did not come back. The recorded history of fatalities at Jacob's Well stretches back to the introduction of scuba technology in the late 1950s, which for the first time gave recreational divers the equipment necessary to attempt depths and durations that earlier generations, working with improvised gear, simply could not reach. Between 1960 and 1985, at least 8 confirmed deaths occurred within the system. The most documented of these took place on September 9, 1979, when 2 young divers, 20-year-old Kent Maupin and 21-year-old Mark Brashear, arrived at the well after dark with a larger group and decided, despite the late hour, to attempt an exploratory dive into the cave's deepest and most narrow chamber. Witnesses from their own group watched them swim into the passage that required removing their tanks to pass through. They did not have backup lights. They did not have a safety line. They never came back out. What followed remains one of the most harrowing documented recovery operations in American cave diving history. Professional salvage divers were brought in. The narrow opening to the chamber where Maupin and Brashear had last been seen kept collapsing under shifting gravel even as crews worked to clear it, undoing days of effort within hours. One diver involved in the search nearly died himself, becoming buried to the waist in sliding sediment before being pulled free by his team, suffering a ruptured stomach in the process. After 12 days, the operation was called off. The bodies of Kent Maupin and Mark Brashear were never recovered. They remain, by every account available, exactly where the cave system took them, sealed beneath the gravel of a chamber that nearly killed the men sent to retrieve them. This is the environment the drone was sent into, not a metaphorical darkness, a specific, mapped, documented system with a known body count, known structural traps, and known sediment. Conditions that can erase visibility in seconds, all of it sitting beneath water so clear and so inviting near the surface that thousands of tourists swim above it every summer with no idea what extends beneath their feet. The use of remotely operated vehicles for cave exploration is not on its own a new or experimental concept. Over the past decade, underwater robotics, researchers have been steadily adapting compact ROV platforms, small, tethered, or autonomous underwater drones originally developed for marine archaeology and shipwreck survey work, for exactly this kind of confined, hazardous cave environment. Systems built around platforms like the Blue ROV 2 have already been deployed inside flooded cave systems in Florida, equipped with sonar, inertial navigation, and increasingly sophisticated computer vision systems specifically, trained to detect and follow the permanent guidelines that cave divers leave behind on every dive, the same lifelines that, when lost, have been responsible for the majority of cave diving fatalities throughout the sport's history. Researchers working on this technology have been explicit about the underlying motivation. Cave exploration and mapping by human divers is, in their own published language, a tedious, labor-intensive, extremely dangerous operation even for highly skilled people. A machine that can navigate the same passages without risking a human life is not a novelty. It is, increasingly, a necessity for systems like Jacob's Well, where the deepest and least understood sections remain effectively closed to further human exploration precisely because the risk has already proven repeatedly to be fatal. When a drone is sent through that first 30-foot vertical shaft and into the angled descent beyond it, what the camera feed actually shows is not a monster. It is something that, for the people who have spent their careers trying to understand this specific cave system, is in some ways more unsettling because it is real and measurable and undeniable in a way no folklore ever could be. The first thing the footage makes immediately, viscerally clear is the scale. Survey data and trail maps can describe a passage extending 4,500 feet from the entrance, can note a maximum depth of 137 feet, can mark the locations of constrictions and chamber walls on a two-dimensional chart, but none of that fully prepares a viewer for what it looks like to watch a camera move continuously through that space in real time. The passage does not feel like a single cave. It feels, as the drone's lights sweep across the limestone walls, like an entire buried world, a structure that took longer to form than the entire span of recorded human history, branching away into side passages and partially explored extensions that even the most experienced members of the Jacob's Well exploration project have not been able to fully chart. The drone's lights illuminate maybe 20 or 30 feet ahead at any given moment, a small, fragile bubble of visibility pushing forward into a system whose full extent is, by the explorer's own admission, still not completely known. The second thing the footage reveals is the sediment. In the wider chambers, where the water is calm and undisturbed by the drone's own propellers, the floor is visible as a smooth, pale expanse of fine silt and gravel. And that smoothness is its own kind of disturbing detail once you understand what it represents. Undisturbed sediment in an enclosed underwater system accumulates slowly, year after year, with nothing to stir it except the rare passage of a diver, or now a drone. The footage of these untouched floors is, in a very literal sense, a view of time itself settling at the bottom of a cave. Layers of mineral and organic material that have been quietly building for periods, that likely extend back centuries, possibly longer, completely undisturbed by anything except the occasional human being who came down here and, in at least 9 documented cases, never went back up. The cave is not lifeless either, and this is where the footage becomes genuinely strange in a way that has nothing to do with fear and everything to do with biology. Drifting through the drone's light at several points in the documented passages are small, pale, almost translucent forms. Aquatic salamanders adapted to a life that has never known sunlight. Species like the Texas blind salamander, native to the spring-fed limestone systems of this region of central Texas, have evolved, over an unknown but clearly substantial span of evolutionary time, to lose the pigmentation and functional eyesight that would be useless in permanent darkness, navigating instead by sensing pressure changes and chemical signals in water that never sees the sun. Watching one of these creatures drift through a drone's spotlight, an animal whose entire evolutionary lineage has existed in total absence of light, produces a specific kind of disorientation that is difficult to describe accurately without seeing it. It is evidence of an entire functioning ecosystem that has been operating invisibly in total isolation from the surface world for a length of time that dwarfs the relatively recent history of human beings, discovering, naming, and occasionally dying inside the cave that contains it. And then there is the false chimney, the formation responsible for at least one confirmed death. And seeing it directly through a stabilized camera feed, rather than through the panicked, oxygen-deprived memory of a surviving diver, changes how the danger actually reads. From the angle the drone's lights catch it, the passage genuinely does appear, for a disorienting moment, to open upward toward brighter water and a possible surface route. It is not subtle the way a simple dead end would be. It is actively, structurally deceptive. A piece of geology that, through pure coincidental erosion over tens of thousands of years, happens to mimic almost exactly the visual signature of safety. Watching footage of it, with the prior knowledge of what it has done to the people who trusted it, produces an entirely different kind of unease than watching ordinary cave wall. It is the geological equivalent of an optical illusion that happens to be capable of killing you. What genuinely troubles people who study this site, though, isn't any single frame of footage. It's the broader pattern that drone access into systems like this is starting to reveal across multiple similar cave networks throughout central Texas and the wider Edwards and Trinity Aquifer regions. Jacob's Well briefly stopped flowing entirely for the first time in its recorded history in the year 2000, a direct consequence of increased groundwater pumping in the rapidly growing Wimberley Valley, straining the aquifer that feeds it. Since 2022, the region has been under sustained drought conditions, and current flow rates at the spring remain measurably below the historical average of roughly 2 million gallons per day. A spring that has, by all available evidence, been flowing continuously for a length of time that predates human settlement of the region, by many thousands of years stopped flowing within living memory, because of decisions made by people living directly above it who had no way of seeing and very little reason to think about the scale and fragility of the system sitting beneath their feet. This is the part of the footage that actually unsettles the hydrogeologists and conservation researchers who work with the Jacob's Well Exploration Project far more than any narrow passage or false chimney ever could. Because what the drone documents, passage by passage, chamber by chamber, is not an abstract concept of an aquifer. It is the literal, physical, three-dimensional reality of an enormous, ancient, slowly forming reservoir of fresh water that an entire regional population depends on, sitting directly beneath a landscape of resort development, residential growth, and recreational tourism that has been expanding for decades with comparatively little public understanding of what is actually underneath it. Watching footage of an apparently endless, branching, partially unmapped underwater cave system is one thing in the abstract. Watching it while holding the knowledge that this exact system nearly went dry within the last 25 years is something else entirely. The Jacob's Well Exploration Project itself has been careful, in its own communications, to draw a clear and explicit line between the genuine scientific and conservation value of this kind of exploration and the kind of sensationalized treatment the site has accumulated across decades of viral articles and ominous documentary segments about its death toll. Their stated purpose has never been to manufacture mystery. It has been methodical, patient mapping, producing what they describe as the most detailed survey to date of the longest cave. In Hays County, in the second longest fully submerged cave system in the entire state of Texas, work conducted specifically to better understand, protect, and eventually help preserve both the cave itself and the aquifer it draws from. But understanding does not erase the visceral effect of actually watching the footage. It does not change the fact that a remotely operated vehicle gliding silently through total darkness, past sediment that has gone undisturbed for long more than any living person has been alive, past blind salamanders that have never once perceived light, past a formation of solid limestone that has killed at least one person by perfectly imitating an exit that does not exist, produces a response in almost anyone who watches it that has nothing to do with supernatural fear and everything to do with a much older, much more rational kind of unease. The specific feeling of confronting something vast, old, and genuinely indifferent to your presence inside it. Kent Maupin and Mark Brashear are still down there. So are at least 7 other people whose names appear in the same incomplete, partial historical record, swallowed by the same gravel and silt that the drone's cameras now glide silently over, lit for a few seconds at a time by a beam of artificial light before the machine moves on, deeper into a system that, even after nearly 2 decades of dedicated professional mapping, still has not given up everything it contains. That is what the footage actually shows. Not a monster, not a myth. Just an enormous, ancient, fully real cave system sitting directly beneath a small green pool that thousands of unsuspecting tourists jump into every single summer. A place that has already proven repeatedly and irreversibly exactly how unforgiving it can be to anyone who goes looking for what's inside it without the right tools, the right caution, or the right respect for just how little of it has actually been seen. The drone came back. Not everyone who has gone looking for what's down there has been so fortunate. Subscribe. Because there are passages in that cave system that still haven't been mapped, and somebody eventually is going to have to go back in.